The sun had barely crept over the horizon when Miriam Collins sat down at her kitchen table, sipping her coffee as she flipped through the travel brochure. The glossy pages showed exotic destinations, sunny beaches, and mountains that seemed to rise up from the clouds. It was the kind of trip she had dreamt of her entire life, an adventure to places far beyond her quiet town. But as her fingers traced the pages, something in her heart felt heavy. She had been waiting for a long time to be invited, to hear the words that would finally make her feel included in the family's plans. But that hadn't happened. The day before, she had sat through the family meeting, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, as they excitedly discussed their upcoming trip. Her son, David, had been the one to speak the loudest, his voice brimming with excitement. Her daughter-in-law, Lisa, had smiled and nodded along, chiming in with suggestions for activities. Even her granddaughter, Emily, who had just graduated high school, seemed eager about the whole idea. But then it had come, like a cold splash of water to the face. "Mom, we've been thinking," David had started, clearing his throat as he glanced at Lisa. "We really want this trip to be about us, the family, you know? Just the kids and grandkids. You're getting up there in age, and it might be better if you just stay here and watch the house." The words hit Miriam like a thunderclap. The room had suddenly felt smaller, quieter. She had forced a smile, her mind swirling as her heart sank. The suggestion was wrapped in the kindest of tones, but the message was clear. She was too old to be a part of their plans. Too old to travel, too old to keep up, too old to be included. Miriam's hands tightened around the coffee mug, the warmth doing little to ease the chill in her chest. She nodded, keeping her voice steady, even though every inch of her wanted to protest. She had been a mother, a grandmother, and a woman who had once traveled the world, but now, she was nothing more than a caretaker. The thought stung, but she had kept her composure. "I understand," she had said. "You go have fun and I'll stay here. The house will be in good hands." Her grandchildren, oblivious to the pain in her eyes, had continued talking excitedly about their plans, never once glancing back to see if their words had hurt. It was as if Miriam didn't even matter anymore. She had gone to bed that night with the same smile on her face, but her heart had felt empty. As she lay in the darkness, staring up at the ceiling, a flood of memories had swept over her. She had traveled to far-off lands in her youth alone with friends, and even with her late husband, Henry. There had been so many adventures, so many experiences that she had cherished. But somewhere along the way, those adventures had faded, replaced by the demands of motherhood, of family, of responsibilities. And now, in the twilight of her life, she had become nothing more than an observer. The following morning, Miriam rose earlier than usual, her heart still heavy with the unspoken rejection from the night before. She went about her daily routine, making breakfast for herself, humming an old tune as she moved through the motions of a life that had become a quiet rhythm. It wasn't until she stepped outside to collect the mail that something unexpected happened. Among the usual bills and advertisements, there was an envelope addressed to her. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the script elegant and precise. Her pulse quickened as she opened it, not knowing what to expect. Inside were 2 travel tickets. She stared at the tickets in disbelief, her eyes darting from the names printed on them. David and Lisa Collins. The same trip they had discussed just hours earlier, the one they had told her to stay out of. And yet here they were, 2 tickets, meant for her. For her and no one else. Confusion swirled in her mind. Had they changed their minds? Had they realized their mistake? She turned the tickets over, looking for a note and explanation. But there was nothing. Just the tickets. 2 bright, shiny promises of adventure that now felt like a cruel joke. Miriam's hands trembled as she held the tickets in her grasp. She couldn't bring herself to speak, to call them, to confront them. Instead, she tucked the tickets into her apron pocket, the weight of them pulling at her. She stared down at the house, her gaze lost in the familiarity of the well-worn porch steps, the flower beds she had tended for years. For a moment, everything felt impossibly small. Her mind raced. They had no intention of including her. This was just a formality, a last-minute afterthought. She could hear the words of David echoing in her mind. It might be better if you stay here and watch the house. She couldn't do it. Not this time. In one swift motion, she pulled the tickets from her pocket and ripped them in half, the sound of the paper tearing sharp in the quiet morning air. It was as though she had torn away a part of her heart, one she had desperately tried to hold on to. There was no room for pity, no room for being made to feel small. She wasn't their burden to bear. The tickets lay in pieces in her hands. She stared at them, feeling the weight of her decision. This wasn't how things were supposed to be. She was still Miriam Collins, strong, independent, and capable of so much more than they gave her credit for. And she would prove it to them. The day dragged on in the quiet stillness of the house, as Miriam sat in her favorite armchair by the window, sipping tea and letting the warmth of the afternoon sun wash over her. The house felt larger now, the walls echoing her solitude in a way that was both familiar and unsettling. She hadn't expected much of the day, really. After all, what was left for her to do? Her family was gone, their excitement still fresh in her mind, their words echoing in her ears. But she couldn't help it. She kept thinking about the tickets. She had told herself to forget about them, to let go of the hurt and the confusion. After all, it wasn't worth dwelling on something so small. But in the quiet moments, when she allowed her mind to wander, the memory of the envelope with the travel tickets kept coming back. It was a peculiar thing to receive those tickets. She could feel their weight in her pocket every time she moved, like a constant reminder of something that should have been. And yet, she had torn them in half, convincing herself that they were nothing more than a cruel reminder of how little she mattered to the family. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden knock on the door. Miriam stood up, her joints creaking with age, and shuffled to the door. She wasn't expecting anyone, perhaps it was a neighbor or a delivery. When she opened it, she found herself staring at the young face of her granddaughter, Emily. "Grandma, hey." Emily beamed, her voice bright as always, though there was something in her eyes that seemed to linger, a touch of concern. "Emily's sweetheart," Miriam said, forcing a smile as she stepped aside to let her in. "What brings you here? Shouldn't you be packing for your big trip?" The mention of the trip caused a slight twitch in Miriam's chest, but she quickly pushed it down. She didn't want Emily to see her sadness. Emily was too young to understand the complexities of family dynamics, too innocent to know the hurt her words had caused. "I just wanted to check on you, Grandma. I mean, you're okay, right? It's a bit weird, not having you with us on this trip." Emily's voice wavered ever so slightly, though Miriam didn't think much of it. "Are you sure you're fine staying here alone?" Miriam nodded, brushing her granddaughter's concern aside. "Oh, I'm fine, dear. I've spent plenty of time on my own. Don't you worry about me." Emily looked hesitant for a moment, but then smiled again, though it seemed more forced this time. "Okay, well, if you need anything, just call me. We're going to have so much fun on this trip, and I promise we'll bring you something nice." Miriam offered her a reassuring smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm sure you will. Now, don't go getting all caught up in packing. Have fun, Emily. This is your time." Emily hesitated once more, her brow furrowing in thought, but then she pulled her grandmother into a quick hug before heading toward the door. Miriam stood at the threshold and watched her leave, her heart heavy with unspoken words. After the door clicked shut, Miriam returned to her armchair, but the moment of calm she had tried to create didn't last long. Her thoughts again drifted back to the tickets, the ones she had torn up. But then, something strange happened. As she reached into the pocket of her apron to retrieve a handkerchief, she felt something smooth. Surprised, she pulled it out. There, in her pocket, were the two halves of the travel tickets she had destroyed. She blinked, her heart racing. How could this be? She had been certain she'd torn them up completely. The paper had been shredded in her hands. And yet here they were, whole again, perfectly intact. Her hands trembled as she examined the tickets more closely. The edges of the paper were a bit jagged, but the tickets themselves looked untouched. She even checked the serial numbers. Everything was the same, David's and Lisa's names printed clearly, the date and destination as though nothing had ever happened. Confusion flooded her mind. She turned the tickets over and over in her hands, searching for any explanation. But there was none. The tickets were here, as if they had never been torn in the first place. "Am I losing my mind?" she whispered to herself. She had never been one to believe in superstitions or odd occurrences, but this was different. Miriam stood up, pacing the room, her mind struggling to make sense of it all. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something beyond her control. Perhaps she had made a mistake, but the tickets were so real, so vivid, so real. It wasn't possible. She couldn't have just imagined the tearing of them. The sound, the feel of the paper, it had been all too real. The questions swirled around in her head like a storm. Why had the tickets reappeared? And why had she been sent them in the first place? Had they changed their minds about excluding her from the trip? Or was this something else altogether? For the first time in hours, Miriam felt a flicker of hope. Maybe there was a chance, after all, that the family wanted her to join them. Maybe they had just made a mistake. Or perhaps this was a way of telling her she was still needed, still valued. Her gaze fell on the tickets once more, now lying innocently on the table. A part of her wanted to pick up the phone and call David to ask him about the tickets, about what they meant. But another part of her hesitated, unsure whether she was ready to confront the family and all the unspoken words that had been left behind. In the end, Miriam decided that she couldn't just wait for someone to make the decision for her. The tickets were hers now, and she would do with them what she felt was right. She wasn't going to let age or hurt stand in her way. The house was quiet again, but this time, Miriam felt a spark within her, a reminder that she still had the power to choose her own path. And this time, she would not be dismissed. The days following the discovery of the tickets passed by slowly, each one stretching out in front of Miriam like an endless road. She couldn't stop thinking about them, the tickets. They felt like a challenge, a question that had been left unanswered. Her mind raced with possibilities. What did they mean? Why had they come to her in the first place? And, more importantly, what was she supposed to do about it? Miriam had always been someone who valued control. In her younger years, she had been the backbone of the family, the one who made things happen, the one who kept everyone together. But somewhere along the way, she had allowed herself to fade into the background. She had accepted the role of being the one who stayed behind, the one who cared for the house while others ventured out into the world. She had been content until now. Now, with the tickets burning a hole in her pocket, Miriam couldn't help but feel a spark of rebellion. She wasn't done yet. She had spent too many years watching life pass her by, and though the years had been kind to her in many ways, they had also made her feel invisible at times. But the tickets? The tickets were a reminder that she still had the ability to choose. She could still make things happen. The more she thought about it, the more it became clear. She couldn't let this chance slip away. This wasn't just about a family trip. This was about her reclaiming her life. This was about proving that no one, least of all her children, had the right to define what she could and couldn't do. Miriam had always been the one to take care of everyone else. Now it was time to take care of herself. But the decision wasn't easy. She had raised her children to be independent, and she had always been the one to sacrifice for them. The thought of leaving the house empty, of taking a trip that might not be what they had envisioned, gnawed at her. She imagined David's face when he found out, the disapproval in his eyes. She could already hear his voice. "Mom, you're not serious, are you?" She had become accustomed to his tone, to his patronizing way of speaking. He thought he knew what was best for her, but Miriam knew better. She walked through the house, her gaze landing on the pictures lining the walls, snapshots of her children growing up, moments frozen in time. There was one of her and Henry, taken on their honeymoon, standing on a beach in a place they had promised to return to. They never did, of course. Henry had passed away long before they could make that trip again. Miriam had put away those dreams, packing them in the same box where she had tucked away her youth. But now, for the first time in a long time, she felt the stirrings of something she hadn't felt in years, a desire to live those dreams. She sat down at the kitchen table, the half-shredded tickets before her. The paper still felt solid in her hands, a tangible reminder that they were real. It was as if they were asking her, "What will you do now, Miriam?" She didn't want to make a decision in haste, so she decided to sleep on it. For the rest of the day, she busied herself with small tasks around the house. She watered the plants, dusted the shelves, and made dinner for herself, a simple meal that was both comforting and lonely. As night fell, the house grew still, and Miriam found herself staring at the flickering light of the fireplace, her mind once again filled with uncertainty. But this time, she didn't push the thoughts away. She let them wash over her, and slowly, the decision began to solidify. She would go. She would take the trip. She wasn't sure where the tickets would lead her, whether it was to the tropical beaches of the brochure or the cold, snowy peaks of the mountains that had been on her bucket list for years. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that she was doing this for herself. It wasn't about proving anything to her family or anyone else. It was about proving something to herself. Miriam was not done living. She still had dreams to chase, places to see, and stories to tell. If they didn't want her to be part of their adventure, then fine. She would create her own. The next morning, after a restless night of pacing and thinking, Miriam finally made up her mind. She would cancel the trip, but not in the way they might have expected. She wouldn't tear the tickets up, wouldn't leave them in a drawer to be forgotten. No, this time, Miriam would take control. She walked into the living room, picked up the phone, and dialed the number on the back of the ticket. The voice on the other end was cheerful, almost too cheerful for her liking. Miriam hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I need to make a change to my reservation," she said, her voice steady, though a surge of emotion washed over her. "I'd like to cancel my cancellation." The woman on the other end was silent for a moment. "I'm sorry, ma'am."
Could you repeat that?
"I'd like to keep the tickets," Miriam said again, her heart beating faster now, as though the words themselves were a declaration of independence. "I'll be using them. For myself." There was a long pause before the woman replied, "Of course, ma'am. Let me just make the necessary adjustments." Miriam hung up the phone, her heart racing.
It was done.
The tickets were hers again. The path was open. As she sat back in her chair, a sense of calm washed over her. She had made the decision, and now there was no turning back. The world was waiting, and for the first time in years, Miriam felt alive with possibility. She wasn't too old. She wasn't too tired. And she wasn't going to let anyone, least of all her family, tell her what she could or couldn't do. She was going to live, and nothing was going to stop her. Miriam's heart raced as she stood at her kitchen table, staring down at the tickets she had just claimed as her own. She felt an unfamiliar sense of excitement bubbling up from within, something she hadn't experienced in years. The house was quiet, too quiet, and yet, she felt like she was on the edge of something important, something that had been missing from her life for far too long. She glanced around the room, almost as if the walls themselves were watching her, waiting for her next move. The decision was made. The tickets were hers. Now, all she had to do was make it happen. The problem, however, was how to do it without anyone finding out. She wasn't ready to share this newfound freedom with her family just yet. She didn't want to deal with their reactions, their concern, or their well-meaning attempts to talk her out of it. She had lived her life for others, her children, her husband, even the neighbors, and this time, for once, it was going to be about her. Miriam didn't want to hear the doubts in David's voice, the way he'd tell her that traveling alone wasn't safe, that it was too much for her at her age. She had been a part of their lives for decades, giving them everything they needed, but now, she was taking something back for herself. She decided to keep her plans a secret. The first step, she realized, was to get things organized quietly. There were little details to consider. Things she hadn't done in years, things she hadn't thought about since her last trip with Henry. For the first time in a long while, she felt like a young woman again, full of anticipation and excitement. Her first call was to the travel agency. She needed to make sure everything was in place and that the tickets hadn't been mistakenly canceled. The woman on the other end confirmed the reservation with a cheerful voice, and Miriam made arrangements for the details, flights, accommodations, and a rental car for when she reached her destination. She wasn't sure where exactly she would go just yet, but she was determined to keep the plans flexible. Maybe a trip to the coast, or perhaps the mountains. She would decide when the time came. For now, the logistics were all she needed to focus on. The next step was packing. Miriam spent the afternoon going through her closet, pulling out clothes that would work for a variety of climates. She didn't need much, just a few basics, comfortable shoes, and a good camera. She had always loved photography, capturing the fleeting moments of her travels. It was something she hadn't indulged in since Henry passed, but now, it felt like the perfect time to revive that passion. She also picked out a few old journals she'd kept over the years. They were filled with her musings, sketches, and memories from her past adventures. Miriam had always been good about documenting her life, and now she wanted to write again. It would be an adventure, and every adventure deserved to be recorded. As she sorted through her things, Miriam couldn't help but smile. There was a sense of exhilaration in the air, a feeling she hadn't had since she was a young woman dreaming of travel. It was as though a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. The plan was simple. She would leave when the time was right. But for now, she kept everything hidden. No one, not even her best friend Helen, would know about her secret journey. This was her time, and she was determined to keep it that way. That evening, as she sat at the kitchen table once more, Miriam allowed herself a moment of reflection. She thought about the years of caring for others, raising children, hosting family gatherings, cleaning, cooking, being the good mother. And while she had loved every minute of it, she couldn't deny the yearning she felt for something more. Something that wasn't tied to duty or expectation. There had been moments, small, fleeting moments, when she had considered doing something just for herself. A trip to Paris, perhaps, or a quiet retreat in the countryside. But life always seemed to get in the way. The needs of her family were constant, and her own needs always came last. But now, at this stage in her life, Miriam was tired of putting herself on the back burner. She had waited too long, and now she was ready to take the reins. She couldn't help but wonder if her family would ever understand. Would they ever realize that she was more than just grandma, more than just the woman who made sure the house was in order? Would they ever see her as the person she used to be, the woman who had a life outside of her roles as mother and grandmother? The woman who had dreams, dreams that still lived inside her, even if they'd been buried for far too long? Miriam shook her head. It didn't matter. The truth was, she was tired of waiting for approval, tired of seeking validation. She wasn't doing this for them. She was doing it for herself. The next morning, she booked her flight, double-checking the details to make sure everything was in place. Her bags were packed and ready to go, though she still hadn't shared the news with anyone. Her phone rang a few times, David, Lisa, but she didn't answer. She wasn't ready to explain herself. Not yet. By the time the day arrived, Miriam was both nervous and exhilarated. The car to the airport was scheduled, her itinerary was ready, and all she had to do was step out the door. Her heart pounded as she grabbed her bags and made her way to the front door. The house seemed almost too still as she turned the key and locked it behind her. It would be waiting for her when she returned, hopefully, she told herself, to a new version of herself. A version that wasn't bound by age, by expectations, by the limits others had set for her. As the car pulled away from the driveway and headed toward the airport, Miriam's thoughts were a blur of excitement and uncertainty. The world was wide open, and for the first time in years, she felt the thrill of the unknown. She was no longer just the caretaker. She was Miriam Collins, and she was about to embark on the greatest adventure of her life. Miriam had always been a planner. In her younger days, she had carefully mapped out every detail of her life, ensuring that everything went smoothly, dinners on time, children to school without delay, vacations that were carefully coordinated down to the smallest detail. But now, as she sat in the back of a taxi, heading toward the airport, she realized just how much she had underestimated the challenge of doing something for herself. She had planned this escape meticulously, but it was different now. The stakes were higher. She wasn't just taking a trip to a quiet cottage in the countryside. She was stepping out of the life she had lived for so long, into a world she had almost forgotten existed. A world that was hers to explore, and yet one that felt terrifying in its unfamiliarity. The challenge wasn't just about booking a flight or packing a suitcase. It was the mental shift. It was the fear of the unknown, of striking out alone after all these years. Miriam's hands clenched around the handle of her suitcase as the car wound its way through the familiar streets of her town, the homes she'd known for decades slipping by like distant memories. Would she be able to do this? Would she be able to handle the journey, the loneliness, the quiet moments when all she had for company was her own thoughts? Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and Miriam's heart skipped a beat. She had been avoiding her son's calls all morning. David had called twice, and she had let the calls go unanswered. She had intended to let the phone ring, to keep her secret intact. But now, with her nerves on edge, she found herself pulling the phone out of her pocket. It was another call from David. Miriam glanced at the screen for a moment before silencing it and tucking it back in her pocket. The phone call could wait. She was finally doing something for herself, something she had wanted for years, and no phone call was going to change that. When they arrived at the airport, Miriam took a deep breath. The bustling crowds, the hurried passengers rushing to their gates, the smell of coffee in the air. Everything felt overwhelming, yet exhilarating. She hadn't traveled alone in so many years. She had forgotten what it was like to be surrounded by strangers, to be a part of a world that was moving at its own pace. Her steps were slow as she made her way to check-in, clutching the ticket tightly in her hand. The young woman behind the counter smiled brightly and asked for her ID, her voice cheery and impersonal. Miriam handed over the ticket and passport, trying to keep her nerves in check. "Thank you, Mrs. Collins," the attendant said, handing back her boarding pass. "Your flight is on time. Enjoy your trip." Miriam managed a smile, though inside, her heart was pounding. She walked toward security, trying not to let the weight of the moment crush her. She had always been someone who kept things together, someone who didn't let nerves show. But today, she was stepping into uncharted territory, and the anxiety gnawed at her. As she made her way through security and waited for her gate to open, Miriam found herself checking her phone once more. Another message from David, this one read, "Mom, please call me.
We're all worried about you."
Where are you? Miriam's stomach twisted. She hadn't prepared herself for this level of concern. She knew it was coming, but the weight of their worry felt heavier than she expected. She stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the screen, unsure whether to respond. She took a deep breath and put the phone back into her bag. She didn't have to explain herself to anyone. Not yet. This trip was about her, not them. She had to remember that. Time passed slowly as she sat in the airport, watching the crowds flow past, feeling both a part of it and apart from it. She glanced at her watch. It was almost time for boarding. Miriam stood up, taking one last look around the airport before she walked to the gate. There was no turning back now. The flight was long but uneventful. Miriam settled into her seat by the window, watching as the world below shrank into a patchwork of roads and fields. Her thoughts were a swirl of excitement and doubt. She wasn't sure exactly where she was headed. She had left that part open. It wasn't about the destination, she realized. It was about the journey itself. Somewhere over the ocean, when the lights of the airplane dimmed and the seatbelt sign went off, Miriam closed her eyes and let herself drift. For the first time in ages, she felt at peace. She wasn't a mother, a grandmother, or a caretaker. She wasn't anyone's responsibility. She was Miriam Collins, a woman with her own dreams, her own desires, and the courage to go after them. But even as her thoughts drifted to a place of calm, a small voice nagged at the back of her mind. The voice of doubt that told her she was being reckless, that she was too old to be taking this kind of risk alone. What if something went wrong? What if she didn't enjoy the trip? What if, after all this time, she realized she was too old to be chasing adventures? The questions were there, but she pushed them aside. She was done second-guessing herself. She had made this decision for a reason, and now there was no turning back. Miriam's feet touched the ground with a quiet thud as the airplane landed, the tires skimming the runway with practiced ease. She hadn't been this far from home in years, decades, actually. The city beneath her was unfamiliar, full of towering buildings and streets that hummed with life. There was something vibrant about it, something alive that made her heart race with excitement. For the first time in what felt like forever, Miriam was no longer just an observer of life. She was fully present, stepping into it with both feet. The airport was busy, as bustling as any major international hub, but Miriam felt strangely at peace. She picked up her suitcase and made her way to the baggage claim, allowing herself to become part of the crowd for once, rather than watching it from the sidelines. It wasn't just the noise or the movement that caught her attention, it was the freedom. There was no one here to tell her what to do, no one to second-guess her decisions. She was her own person, walking a path that was entirely hers to carve. The thrill of the unknown was a heady feeling. She had no itinerary to follow, no one waiting for her, and no family to worry about. It was all just her, and the world was wide open. After collecting her luggage, Miriam made her way outside to the taxi stand. She had a hotel reservation, of course, but she hadn't decided whether to go directly there or take a detour. Maybe she'd visit a museum, or explore a local cafe, or simply wander the streets and let the city's energy lead her wherever it wanted. She wasn't in a hurry to check off boxes. This time, the journey was the destination. As she climbed into the back of the taxi, the driver glanced at her through the rearview mirror. Miriam gave him the address of her hotel, her voice steady but tinged with excitement. The driver nodded, his expression neutral, and they pulled away from the airport, merging into the flow of traffic. Miriam gazed out of the window, taking in the new sights, the sprawling cityscape, the clusters of people moving in all directions, the bright lights of neon signs advertising things she couldn't understand. The rhythm of the city was different from her quiet little town, and it was exhilarating. There was a part of her that could hardly believe she was here, that she was actually living out a dream she had put aside for so many years. For the first time in a long time, Miriam felt alive. It wasn't the kind of life that was dictated by responsibilities or obligations. There were no bills to pay, no laundry to fold, no meals to cook. She was free. The taxi took her through narrow streets lined with tall buildings, the air tinged with the scent of street food and exhaust. Miriam's eyes darted to the various shops they passed, boutiques, bakeries, bookstores, each one offering something new, something exciting. It was like a different world, one where anything was possible. Finally, they reached her hotel. It was a modest place, nothing too extravagant, but it had a charm to it that appealed to Miriam's sense of simplicity. The bellhop greeted her with a polite smile and took her luggage, and Miriam made her way up to her room. The hotel room was small but comfortable, with a large window that looked out onto the street below. Miriam stood by the window for a moment, taking in the view. The city stretched out before her, full of possibilities. She dropped her suitcase on the bed and stood there for a while, letting the quiet wash over her. This was it. She was here, alone, in a place that wasn't defined by anyone else's expectations. It was hers to explore, to embrace, and she could feel the weight of the years she had spent waiting for this moment lifting from her shoulders. Miriam unpacked her bag slowly, each item she took out reminding her of the life she was leaving behind and the new life she was stepping into. She carefully folded her clothes and placed them in the drawers, her fingers lingering over the fabric. She'd been so meticulous in her packing, trying to prepare for every possible scenario. But now, as she unpacked, she felt a sense of freedom she hadn't known in years. Her camera, the one she hadn't used since Henry's death, sat on the top of her suitcase, its black leather strap still as smooth as the day she bought it. She had packed it with the intention of taking photos, of capturing the moments that would make this trip hers. She lifted the camera out, holding it in her hands as though it were an old friend, something that connected her to a past she had once embraced so wholeheartedly. There was a time when Miriam had been a passionate photographer. When Henry was alive, they had traveled the world, snapping pictures of every landscape, every person they met. They had captured memories, and Miriam had always loved the way photographs allowed her to preserve moments forever. But somewhere along the way, she had put the camera down. She had stopped seeing the world through the lens, had stopped seeing herself as someone who could still create. As she looked at the camera now, Miriam realized that it wasn't just about capturing memories. It was about capturing the present, the here and now. She wasn't just taking pictures for the sake of nostalgia. She was taking them to document the new version of herself, the woman who was rediscovering her own freedom. After a few moments, Miriam slipped the camera around her neck, adjusted the strap, and headed out the door. It was time to begin. She wasn't sure where she would go first, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that she was going. The streets outside the hotel were teeming with life, people rushing in every direction. Miriam felt a little out of place at first, like a stranger in a foreign land, but that feeling quickly faded as she took her first steps into the unknown. The city was full of stories waiting to be discovered, and Miriam, camera in hand, was ready to begin her own story.